The man in the gray jacket was standing at the edge of my driveway before I even got out of the car, and something about the way he stood there, still, waiting, made my stomach drop before he said a single word. "Ma'am, I need you to confirm your name." I had just come from picking up flowers I forgot to bring to the cemetery 2 days ago. My husband wasn't even cold in the ground yet, and this man was standing in my driveway like he'd been sent by God to remind me grief doesn't get to sit still. Mrs. Odessa from 2 doors down was at her mailbox, pretending to sort through envelopes she'd already checked twice. I could feel her watching without looking. That's the thing about a small street. Everybody knows your business before you do. "I'm going to need a name, ma'am," he said again, calmer this time, like he'd done this 1,000 times to 1,000 women standing exactly where I was standing. "My name is Priscilla Winfield, and up until that Tuesday morning, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I had buried my husband of 31 years 4 days earlier. I thought grief was going to be the mountain I had to climb. I didn't know somebody was building a whole new one behind my back. Yes, I told him. That's me. He handed me a thin stack of papers folded in a blue backing, said, "Have a good day," like he was handing me a receipt, and walked back to his car. Mrs. Odessa was still at her mailbox. I gave her a small nod, the kind you give when you don't want anybody to see your hands shaking, and I walked inside my own house, like my legs remembered the way better than my mind did. I want to ask you something before I go any further, because I have a feeling some of you already know exactly the kind of silence I walked into that day. Drop in the comments where you're watching from right now, because wherever you are, I need you to sit with me through what I'm about to tell you. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter. I set the folded blue papers down next to it. I looked at them for a long moment before I even let myself touch them again, because some part of me, the part that spent years reading exactly this kind of paper for other people, already knew what shape this was going to take. I opened it anyway. The first page had a case number, a court name I recognized because I used to walk those halls for a living, though nobody in my family ever really understood what "for a living" meant when it came to me. My name was typed clean across the defendant line, Priscilla Winfield. And right above it, in bold, unmistakable print, was a name that split something open in my chest. Plaintiff, Jared Winfield, my son. I read it 3 times before it made any sense, and even then it didn't make sense. Not really, because sense would have required my son to have called me first, to have asked me anything, to have given me one single chance to explain whatever he thought I had done. Instead, he'd sent a stranger to my driveway to hand it to me like a stranger himself. I turned the page, my hands steadier now than they had any right to be, needing to understand exactly what my own child believed about me. And there it was, one word, sitting alone at the top of the next section, waiting for me. Exploitation. I didn't cry when I read that word. I want you to understand that, because I surprised myself. I folded the papers back along their crease, set them on the counter like they were somebody else's mail, and did the only thing that made sense to a woman who had just buried her husband. I went to his closet. Because there is nothing in this world you can do about a lawsuit at 9 in the morning, but there is something you can do about a man's shirts still hanging exactly where he left them. Sherman kept his side of the closet the way he kept everything, organized loud, the way he talked, bright ties bunched together like they were arguing with each other. I started with the jackets, folding each one before I set it in the donation bag. And for a while, it felt good, useful, like grief finally had somewhere to put its hands. Then my fingers hit something hard behind his winter coats. A metal box, gray, small enough to carry under one arm, with a lock built into its front like it had opinions about being found. I didn't recognize it. 31 years of marriage. And I could have told you the brand of every pair of shoes that man owned. But I had never once seen this box. My phone rang from the kitchen before I could pull it forward. I almost let it go. Grief has taught me plenty about which sounds deserve my attention right away and which ones can wait. But something in me, some old instinct I hadn't used in years, told me to listen. I didn't answer. I let it ring itself into voicemail, box still in my hands, and when the little chime came through a minute later, I played the message standing right there in the closet doorway, coat hangers pressed against my shoulder. Mrs. Winfield, this is Desmond Aldridge's office, representing your son in the matter filed this week. We'd like to schedule a time to discuss the claims directly. Please return this call at your earliest convenience. Direct. Clipped. The kind of voice that's been trained to sound polite while making it clear there's nothing polite happening underneath it. So this wasn't a mistake. Wasn't a piece of paper some overwhelmed lawyer sent out too fast. My son had hired somebody. My son had sat down, somewhere, with somebody, and decided this was worth doing. I set the phone down on top of the dresser and looked at the box again, because looking at it was easier than sitting with what that voicemail meant. The lock gave easier than I expected. I found the small key taped underneath, the way Sherman always hid things he didn't want found quickly, but didn't want lost forever either. I lifted the lid slow, half expecting old letters, maybe receipts, maybe nothing at all. Instead, sitting right on top was a photograph I hadn't seen in over 20 years, and beneath it, a single folded note in Sherman's handwriting. So it's never forgotten, even if she never wants it spoken of. It was me in the photograph, younger, sharper around the eyes, standing outside a courthouse I used to know better than my own street, wearing a blazer I'd forgotten I owned, holding a folder against my chest like it held something worth protecting. It was a version of myself my own son had never met, never asked about, never once wondered why his mother sometimes disappeared into rooms full of lawyers and came back saying nothing about what she'd done there. Sherman never asked either, not after the first few years. He'd learned early that I kept that door closed on purpose, and instead of pushing it open, he'd simply kept a piece of it safe, quietly, for a day I never expected to come. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, photograph in one hand, the note in the other, my son's lawyer's voice still sitting fresh in my ear, and for the first time since the funeral, I didn't know which ache to feel first. I sat with that photograph for a long time before I let myself pick up the phone, because some part of me still believed a conversation could undo what a piece of paper had already started. I called Jared directly, not the lawyer's office, not a text he could read and ignore. I wanted to hear my son's voice because I still believed, foolishly maybe, that whatever this was had to be a misunderstanding I could clear up in 5 minutes if he'd just let me. He picked up on the third ring. Priscilla. Not Mom. Not even a hello first. Just my name, flat, like he was reading it off a name tag. Jared, baby, I got the papers this morning. I need you to tell me what's going on, because none of this makes sense to me. There was a pause on his end, the kind of pause that told me he wasn't reacting. He was reciting. I think it's best we let the attorneys handle the details of the case moving forward. The case? I said it back to him slow, testing how strange it sounded coming out of my own mouth about my own son. Jared, this is not a case. This is you and me. You had every opportunity to be transparent with me, he said, and I felt something twist in my chest, because those weren't his words. I raised that boy. I know the difference between Jared thinking something and Jared repeating something somebody handed him to say. Transparent about what? I kept my voice even, though it cost me. Say it plain. Whatever you think I did, say it to me plain. Son to mother, not lawyer to lawyer. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear him breathing, and underneath that, faintly, I could hear something else. Another voice in the room with him, too low for words, but close enough that I knew he wasn't alone. You knew Dad's health was declining, he finally said, and you controlled everything around him, every account, every decision, and I never got so much as a conversation about what was actually mine. Yours, I repeated. You heard me. I closed my eyes. I thought about 30 years of packed lunches, of missed business calls so I could be at his school plays, of a whole life folded down small so his could stay big and simple and untouched. And here he was, calling all of that theft. Jared, I need you to listen to me for 1 minute without anybody else in that room feeding you what to say next. There's nobody else here, he said too fast. And I knew right then I was talking to a man reading from a script somebody else had written for him. Somebody who had never once sat across a dinner table from me. Somebody who didn't know the first thing about who I was before I was his mother. I'm going to ask you one time, I said. Do you actually believe I stole from your father? Or are you just repeating what somebody told you to feel? The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought he might actually answer me honestly. Long enough that some small, foolish part of me held its breath, hoping. Then his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough that I heard my real son underneath the rehearsed one, for 1 single second. You were always too busy hiding things to actually be my mother. He hung up before I could say another word. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Sherman and I had shared for 3 decades, staring at a ceiling that suddenly felt too far away, replaying my son's voice until it stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a wound. My phone lit up on the nightstand a little after 10 the next morning. Jared's name on the screen. My heart did something foolish and hopeful, some old reflex that still believed he might be calling to take it all back. I answered. Jared? Nothing but background noise. A television somewhere low. The clink of a dish being set down, and beneath it, the muffled shuffle of fabric against a phone screen. The unmistakable sound of a call made by an elbow or a countertop, not a hand. I should have hung up right then. Any decent person would have. But I stayed on that line, phone pressed careful against my ear, because I heard a voice underneath the noise that wasn't his, and something in me, some part I hadn't let loose in years, told me to listen. You can't say it like that to the attorney, Jared. You have to make it clear she was controlling everything. That's the whole case. Chantel. I don't know, Jared said, and his voice sounded smaller than it had on the phone with me, less rehearsed, more like the boy I raised than the man who'd hung up on me. It feels wrong saying she was hiding things when I don't actually know that she was. She was, Chantel said, flat, certain, the way people talk when they've already decided a thing and only need everyone else to catch up. Think about it. All those years, controlling every account, never once explaining herself. That's not normal, Jared. That's a woman with something to protect. She raised me, Jared said, quieter. She was always just there. Exactly, Chantel shot back. Always there, always watching, always in charge of everything and telling you nothing. You don't find that strange? A woman that controlling, and you're just now finding out what she was really sitting on. I heard him exhale, long and uncertain. A man being talked into something he hadn't fully decided on his own. Just tell Aldridge what I told you to say, Chantel said. Isolated, controlling, vulnerable father. That's the story. That's what wins this. Okay, Jared said. Just that. Okay? Not conviction. Surrender. Somewhere behind their voices, I heard a faint, tinny, hold music loop start up. The kind that plays while a call sits connected but unanswered on the other end. And I understood then that Jared's phone had likely dialed me by accident while sitting forgotten on a counter or cushion nearby. The screen touched wrong in passing. I sat up slow in that empty bed. Phone still pressed to my ear, and I made myself a promise right there in the dark. I would not cry over this one. I had cried enough for 1 week to last me the rest of my life. I hung up without a word. Let them believe the call had simply dropped, the way accidental calls do. I lay back against the pillows, and for the first time since the funeral, what moved through me wasn't grief. It was something colder, older, more useful. I recognized it, even after all these years of keeping it tucked away. It was the feeling of watching, not just witnessing. The difference between a woman who lets things happen to her and a woman who starts paying attention to exactly how they're happening. By morning, I had a name pulled up on my laptop. A general estate attorney a friend from church had used years back for a property dispute. Nothing fancy, nothing that would know the first thing about the kind of case being built against me. But it was a start. And starts were something I still knew how to make. I picked up the phone and dialed his office before I let myself lose my nerve. The courthouse smelled the same way it always had, old wood polish and cold air conditioning. And walking through those doors again after all these years felt less like memory, and more like stepping back into a version of myself I'd folded away a long time ago. My attorney, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Garrison, who'd handled a property dispute for a friend of mine years back, sat beside me at the defense table, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. He meant well. I could already tell that meaning well wasn't going to be enough. Jared sat across the aisle, spine straight, eyes fixed somewhere on the wall behind the judge's empty bench. Not once did he look at me. Not once did his eyes so much as drift in my direction. And I understood then that avoiding my face had become a decision he made on purpose, something he had to work at. Chantel sat beside him, hands folded, posture perfect, watching the room like she already owned the outcome. The judge presiding over this scheduling conference was not Braddock. Some other man, tired-looking, moving through his calendar like he had 4 more of these before lunch. When it came time for our case, he asked counsel to briefly summarize the nature of the dispute so the court could set an appropriate trial timeline. Jared's attorney, Desmond Aldridge, rose smooth and confident. Your Honor, in brief, this matter involves allegations of undue influence exercised over the decedent, Sherman Winfield, by his spouse, during a period of declining cognitive health. We anticipate needing several months for discovery given the financial records involved. I sat very still. I had heard language like that used against other people years ago from the other side of a courtroom, back when I was the one building a case instead of defending against one. Hearing it aimed at me felt like being handed a mirror I didn't ask for. Mr. Garrison rose beside me. For the record, Your Honor, the defense disputes that characterization entirely and will be prepared to demonstrate as much through the discovery process. He sat back down. I appreciated the effort. I just didn't trust it to be enough. The judge nodded, set a trial date, confirmed a discovery schedule, and moved on to his next case. Like ours, had been nothing more than a formality on his morning list. We filed out into the hallway afterward, Jared moving quickly ahead like he couldn't get out of that building fast enough. Chantel lingered half a step behind him, and as she passed me, close enough that no one else could hear, she slowed just slightly. I hope it was worth it, she said, smiling thin and polite, the kind of smile you'd give a stranger holding a door. I didn't answer her. I didn't even turn my head. Some fights aren't worth spending your voice on, and I recognized this one for exactly what it was. A woman testing to see if she could still get a rise out of me. She couldn't. Not that day. I watched them walk off together, Jared's shoulders tight, Chantel's hand resting lightly at his back like she was steering him, and I thought about how little that boy of mine knew about the kind of woman he'd chosen to stand beside. Mr. Garrison touched my elbow gently, already talking about next steps, filing deadlines, discovery requests. I heard maybe half of it. My mind was already somewhere else, already circling the same uncomfortable truth. This case needed sharper hands than his. Before we reached the door, a clerk stepped out from behind the desk, calling out the trial judge assignment for the record. Judge Trevor Braddock. I stopped walking. I sat with that name the whole ride home. Braddock. I said it under my breath twice in the car, testing it the way you test a key in a lock you haven't used. In years, not sure if it still turns. By the time I got home, I couldn't sit still long enough to eat. I went straight to the small office at the back of the house, the one Sherman used to call my thinking room, and pulled out the old laptop I hadn't opened since before he got sick. It took a while to boot up, groaning like it resented being woken. I typed the name into my own case log, the private notes I kept from my investigator years, back when I tracked every file I ever worked, even after it left my hands and went on to become somebody else's case to argue. Braddock, T. One entry came up. My own summary, dated over 2 decades back, noting an insurance fraud ring I'd spent the better part of a year unraveling, who the evidence went to, which office picked it up, how the case moved once it left my desk. I remembered the case. I hadn't thought about the name attached to it in years. My notes said the file had been routed through a young assistant district attorney handling intake, T. Braddock. I'd fed that office evidence for months through reports and findings, never once sitting across a table from the man reading them. That was how it worked back then. I did the digging. Somebody else stood in the courtroom and used what I found. I remembered thinking, even then, from what little came back to me through the attorneys I did speak with, that whoever this young ADA was, he asked sharp, specific follow-up questions, the kind that told me he understood exactly what he was looking at instead of just checking boxes. I searched further, curious now in a way that had nothing to do with my own case and everything to do with old habit. An archived news clip came up. Grainy, local news footage from a courthouse steps interview, dated a year after that case closed. A young man in an ill-fitting suit, maybe 30 years old, spoke into a reporter's microphone about a conviction his office had just secured. Confident, careful with his words, choosing them like he already understood the weight they'd carry someday. I paused the clip and studied his face. Younger, thinner, but unmistakably the same bone structure, the same steady eyes I'd glimpsed once or twice in old news photos over the years since. Trevor Braddock. The prosecutor whose early convictions were quietly built, in part, on evidence I gathered and handed off without ever once shaking his hand. Now he was a judge. Now he was the one who'd decide whether my son's lawsuit against me had any legs to stand on. I sat back in my chair, laptop glow lighting up the dark room around me, and felt something stir in my chest I hadn't let myself feel since before Sherman's diagnosis. Not certainty, not relief, just a small, careful flicker of something that dared to hope this might matter. I didn't trust it yet. Hope has a way of making a fool out of a woman who lets it in too early. I closed the laptop slow, the screen's glow fading to nothing, and sat there a moment longer in the dark. I didn't tell Mr. Garrison what I'd found. I didn't tell anyone. Some things, I've learned, are worth holding close until you're sure of what they're worth. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt since before Sherman got sick. The kind of clarity that used to mean I had a case to build and no patience left for sitting still. I made coffee, I didn't drink, and cleared the dining room table of everything except a legal pad and my reading glasses. The way I used to clear a desk before a long stretch of work nobody was going to thank me for until it was finished. The business I built, filed under my maiden name, Priscilla Delacroix, long before I ever answered to Winfield, though nobody in my family ever called it anything but Priscilla's work, had always been mine. Not in the sentimental sense, in the legal sense. Registered and structured under my own name years before I ever wore a wedding ring. Back when I was a younger woman, building something out of nothing but stubbornness and a talent for finding what other people tried to bury. I'd updated the filings to reflect my married name years into the marriage. A formality, nothing more. Ownership never once changed hands in the process. I pulled the old filing cabinet key out from the back of my dresser drawer, the one Sherman used to tease me about, calling it my treasure chest key, like I was hiding gold instead of paperwork. In a way, I suppose I was. The storage unit I kept 2 towns over held boxes I hadn't opened in years, articles of organization, tax filings, ownership documents dated with a precision I was grateful for now in a way I never expected to be. I spent the better part of the day there, sleeves pushed up, dust on my hands, pulling folder after folder and laying them out across a folding table like evidence in a case I once would have built against somebody else. The original filing establishing my sole ownership was dated 6 years before I ever met Sherman. 6 years before love, before marriage, before a little boy who would grow up to believe his father built everything he saw around him. I laid that document flat and stared at it a long while, feeling something settle in me that hadn't been there since the funeral. Not comfort, exactly. Something steadier than comfort. Certainty. I spent the evening cross-referencing every renewal, every amendment, every small administrative filing across 3 decades, making sure the paper trail told one consistent story from beginning to end. Hers. Only ever hers. Long before there was ever a theirs to argue about. By the time I got home, exhausted in a way that felt earned instead of hollow, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. Steady ground. That feeling lasted until my phone rang just after 9 that night. "Mrs. Winfield, it's Garrison." His voice had none of its usual mild, unhurried calm. "I need you to come in first thing tomorrow. Opposing counsel just submitted new documentation ahead of trial." "What kind of documentation?" He paused, and in that pause, I felt the ground I'd spent all day rebuilding shift slightly under me. A joint bank account application. Old, from years back. It's got Sherman's signature on it and language suggesting shared ownership of at least one account tied to the business. He hesitated again. "I have to ask you directly. Did you know about this?" I sat down slow at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd laid out a day's worth of proof that everything had always been mine. "No," I said. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I meant it completely. "I don't know what he's talking about." I didn't sleep that night, not one real minute of it, because a small voice in the back of my mind kept asking a question I didn't have an answer to yet. What if I was wrong about something I'd built my whole life on being right about? Garrison had emailed over a copy of the document before I even got home from his office. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at it under the lamplight, reading it over and over like repetition alone might change what it said. It was real. A joint signature card, dated 11 years back, tied to an operating account under my business. Sherman's signature sat right there next to mine, clean and legible, exactly where a co-signer's name belongs. For a stretch of time I'm not proud of, I let myself panic. I sat there running through every version of what this could mean. Every way opposing counsel could twist a single signature into a story about a woman who'd shared control all along and simply changed her mind once it suited her. I thought about Chantel's face in that hallway, that thin, polite smile. And I understood, sitting there in my own kitchen at 1 a.m, exactly how triumphant she was going to feel once she saw this laid out in front of a jury. I made myself get up. Panic has never solved anything in my life, and I wasn't about to let it start tonight. I went back to the boxes I'd pulled from storage, the same ones spread across my dining room table from the day before, and started over from the beginning. Slower this time, reading every page instead of skimming for what I already believed I'd find. It took me until nearly 4 a.m, eyes burning, coffee gone cold beside me, before I found it. A folder I'd almost overlooked, marked in my own handwriting from years back. Operating account, authorized signer. The joint signature card wasn't a transfer of ownership at all. It was a routine banking decision I'd made that same year, adding Sherman as an authorized signer on one specific operating account so he could handle basic deposits while I traveled for a case that kept me out of town for weeks at a time. Banks require that kind of paperwork for anyone given deposit access, regardless of ownership. It's a convenience arrangement, nothing more. It never touched the ownership filings. Never touched control of the business itself. It was paperwork any bank manager would recognize on sight, but out of context, on its own. Sitting in front of 12 strangers in a jury box, it could look like exactly what Chantel wanted it to look like. I sat back in my chair as the sky outside started turning gray, relief moving through me slow and uneven, like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. I had the truth. I was sure of that now. But I understood something else too. Sitting there in the quiet, with the sun coming up, knowing the truth, and being able to make 12 strangers believe it under pressure were two very different skills. And I wasn't sure Garrison had the second one in him. I thought about the hallway outside that courtroom, about Chantel's certainty, about how confident she'd looked walking away with Jared's arm under her hand. I couldn't do this with a man who handled property disputes for church friends. Not anymore. I picked up my phone as the first full light of morning came through my kitchen window, and I searched for a name I'd heard once, years ago, from a colleague who swore up and down there wasn't a case this woman couldn't take apart. Bernice Holloway's office wasn't fancy, but everything in it looked like it had earned its place there. And so did she. She didn't stand when I walked in. Didn't offer the polite smile most people give a new client walking in scared and desperate. She looked up from a folder already open on her desk. My folder. The one I'd sent over 2 days before, and studied me for a long moment before she said a word. "Sit down, Mrs. Winfield." I sat. "I read what you sent." She tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. "The joint account card. You want to explain to me why that doesn't look, on its face, like exactly what your son's lawyer is going to say it is?" "It was a tax restructuring," I said. "A secondary signer added to one operating account so my husband could handle deposits while I traveled for—" "That's what you told me in the email," she cut in. Not unkind, but not soft either. "I'm asking what proof you have that isn't just your word." I felt something rise in me I hadn't felt directed at me in a long time. The particular sting of being doubted by somebody I needed on my side. "I have the original filing," I said, keeping my voice level. I have the tax year documentation. I have the correspondence with my accountant at the time explaining the restructuring, dated the same month. Show me. I pulled the folder from my bag and laid it open across her desk, page by page, the way I used to lay evidence out for prosecutors who needed more than my say-so to move on a case. The original ownership filing, 6 years before I ever married Sherman. The tax restructuring memo. The accountant's letter, dated and signed, explaining plainly why a second signature had been added to that one account and nothing else. Holloway read every page slow, no rush in her at all, occasionally circling back to compare dates against each other like she was hunting for a crack I might have missed. This filing, she said finally, tapping the original ownership document, predates your marriage by 6 years. It does. And the joint account card is dated 11 years after that. It is. She sat back in her chair, studying me now instead of the papers. You built a real business. On your own. Before any of this. I did. For the first time since I'd walked in, something in her posture shifted, just slightly. The tight skepticism loosening into something closer to respect. Most people who come through that door with a story this clean are lying, she said. You're not lying. No, I said. I'm not. She closed the folder slow, tapping it once against the desk to straighten the pages inside, and looked at me with a different kind of attention now. Sharper, more curious. Tell me about your work, she said. The real work. Before the business had a name on paper. I told her. Not everything. Some things I still wasn't ready to say out loud to a stranger, even when I was starting to trust. But enough. Fraud investigation. Decades of it. Cases that never carried my name in any headline, because that was never how the work was done. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she leaned forward slightly, studying me the way I used to study a case file that had just started making sense. Is there anyone in that courtroom, she asked, who might actually know your work? I answered Holloway's question 3 days before we ever set foot back in that courthouse. A few names came to me slower than I expected. People I hadn't spoken to in years. A former colleague I used to trade case files with. An attorney I'd helped put away a man who'd swindled an entire retirement community out of their savings. Holloway made a few calls. I didn't ask what she said to them. I found out what she said when I walked into that courtroom. The gallery was fuller than I expected for a case like mine. I recognized a face near the back. Odell Marsh, a fraud attorney I hadn't seen since a case we'd worked together nearly 15 years ago, nodding once in my direction like he wasn't sure yet if I'd remember him. I did. 2 rows up sat a woman I didn't know, notepad in hand. The unmistakable posture of somebody covering a story rather than living one. Holloway had mentioned, almost in passing, that a small legal affairs blog covering local civil disputes had picked up on the case docket. A woman accused of exploiting her dying husband, once a name quietly known in fraud circles herself. It was the kind of irony that made for an easy Tuesday post, nothing more, but it was enough to put someone in that seat. Holloway leaned toward me as we settled at the defense table. Judge can end this early if the evidence falls apart in front of him, she said, low enough for only me to hear. Doesn't always happen, but it happens. I nodded, though my eyes had already drifted to the bench, empty for now, waiting. Jared sat across the aisle, jaw tight, staring straight ahead the way he had at the last hearing. Chantel sat beside him, back straight, composed. A woman confident in the story she'd spent weeks building. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Treville Braddock walked in. He looked exactly like the man in that old news clip, aged the way a serious life ages a serious face, steady, unreadable. A man who'd learned a long time ago not to let a courtroom see what he was thinking. His eyes swept the room once, professional, unbothered, before settling briefly on the case file in front of him. Winfield versus Winfield, he read aloud, Flat. Procedural. Just a name on a docket to him. Nothing more. Not yet. I felt something tighten in my chest, watching him look right past me without a flicker of recognition. And I reminded myself, the way I had for days now, that this was exactly what I expected. He'd never once seen my face, only my case notes, years ago, routed through other hands before they ever reached his. Desmond Aldridge rose first, buttoning his jacket with the practiced calm of a man who believed he already had the room. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, voice smooth, unhurried. "This case is about a woman who spent her entire life becoming very, very good at hiding things." A small ripple moved through the gallery behind me. I didn't turn to look at it. "Priscilla Winfield built a career finding what other people tried to bury," Aldridge continued, letting the words land slow and deliberate. "And we intend to show that when it came to her own husband's declining health, she used every one of those skills, not to protect him, but to build a life on deception, right under her family's nose." I sat perfectly still, hands folded, spine straight, and let the words move through me without giving him the reaction he was hoping for. Aldridge let his opening line sit in the air a long moment before he moved on, the way a man does when he wants a jury to marinate in an accusation before he gives them anything else to think about. "My client's father," he continued, "spent his final years in cognitive decline, isolated from full financial transparency by the one person who controlled every account, every document, every decision made in that household." He turned toward the jury box, voice steady, rehearsed. "The evidence will show a joint bank signature card bearing Sherman Winfield's own handwriting, proving he had a legitimate claim to assets his wife now insists were always solely her own." He didn't hold up the document itself, only described it, the way an opening statement is supposed to work, a promise of what testimony would later prove, not proof laid out before a single witness had spoken. "A man doesn't sign his name to something he has no stake in," Aldridge said, "unless someone convinced him, otherwise for years." I kept my hands folded in my lap, my spine straight, my face arranged into the same composed stillness I'd worn since I first walked into that courtroom. It cost me more than anyone in that room could see, but I'd spent a lifetime learning that the moment you let your face answer an accusation, you've already lost something you can't get back. Across the aisle, I heard it before I saw it. A short, low laugh from Jared, barely more than an exhale, but unmistakable. He leaned slightly toward Chantel, murmuring something too quiet for me to catch, and she answered with a small shake of her head aimed directly at me, the same thin, dismissive gesture she'd given me in that hallway weeks ago. They thought my silence was guilt. I understood that, watching them, the way you understand a stranger's mistake from a distance, clearly, and with no way to stop it before it happens. My son believed my composure was the look of a woman caught, not a woman who had spent decades learning exactly how much a face can betray if you let it. I glanced at him once, just once, and he didn't hold my eyes. He looked back toward Aldridge instead, jaw set, certain. Beside me, Holloway sat perfectly still through all of it, her expression giving away nothing, a legal pad in front of her covered in notes I couldn't read upside down. "The defense would have you believe," Aldridge said, turning back to the jury, "that ownership never changed hands, that everything remained, conveniently, entirely hers. I would ask you to keep an open mind about why a dying man's name appears on paperwork tied to assets he was never supposed to touch." He folded his hands. "That concludes my opening statement, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Jared Winfield to the stand." I felt something tighten in my chest, watching my son rise and cross toward the witness box, his shoulders squared, his eyes still refusing to find mine. Holloway leaned toward me, voice low enough for only me to hear. "This is where it starts, she said. Let them build it. We'll take it apart piece by piece when it's our turn. I nodded once, folding my hands tighter in my lap, and watched my son raise his right hand to be sworn in against me. Jared sat stiff in the witness box, answering Aldridge's gentle questions about his father's final years, his voice steady enough, rehearsed enough, until Aldridge finally turned to the joint signature card and asked him to describe what it meant to him. It meant my father had a stake in that business, Jared said. That whatever she says now, he was never shut out the way she's trying to make it look. Aldridge nodded, satisfied, and passed the witness. Holloway rose slow, unhurried, holding 3 documents in her hand instead of 1. Mr. Winfield, she began, you testified this signature card proves your father had a stake in the business. Do you know when this business was originally established? Jared hesitated. Not exactly. No. Holloway entered the first document into evidence. This filing establishes sole ownership under the name Priscilla Delacroix, 6 years before your mother married your father. Were you aware your mother had ever gone by that name? No, he said, quieter now. This second document, Holloway continued, is the administrative amendment updating that same filing to reflect her married name, Winfield, several years into the marriage. Ownership itself never changed, only the name on record. Were you aware of that filing either? No. And this third document, she said, holding up the letter I'd found at 4 a.m. weeks earlier, is a written explanation from the family's accountant, dated the same month as the signature card, describing it as a routine addition of a secondary signer for deposit purposes only. Were you aware of this letter? No. Barely audible now. So the signature card you testified proves your father had a stake in this business. You had no knowledge the business existed under a different name before your parents even married, no knowledge of the amendment, and no knowledge of the letter explaining the signature card's actual purpose. Is that fair to say? Jared's jaw tightened. He glanced toward Chantel, who sat rigid, whispering something urgent to Aldridge, who kept his eyes fixed forward, unmoving. I didn't know any of that, Jared finally admitted. Holloway let the silence hold a moment before turning back toward the bench. No further questions, Your Honor. Aldridge rose briefly, attempted one redirect question about isolation and control, got a stammering non-answer, and sat back down. Moments later, he announced the plaintiff rested. The defense calls Priscilla Winfield, Holloway said. I rose and walked to the stand, feeling steadier than I had any right to feel. 30 years of instinct settling into my spine like an old coat I'd forgotten still fit. Once I was sworn in, Holloway asked me to confirm the same 3 documents, and I gave the same clean, exact answers I'd rehearsed with her. The original filing under my maiden name, the later amendment, the restructuring letter, the plain truth laid out in order. Mrs. Winfield, Holloway said, opposing counsel has characterized you as a woman who spent her career becoming very good at hiding things. I want to ask you directly. What was your career before this business ever had either name on a filing? The room settled into a stillness I recognized from a lifetime of courtrooms. I was a fraud investigator, I said, for over 20 years. The stillness deepened, a tension sharpening around me. And in that work, Holloway continued, did you have occasion to build cases later prosecuted by this county's district attorney's office? I did, many times. Holloway paused, letting that settle before asking the question I hadn't expected her to ask so plainly. Mrs. Winfield, is it possible that someone in this very courtroom once relied on your work without ever having met you? I answered Holloway's question the only way I knew how. Plain, unhurried, letting the truth do what truth does best when you finally stop hiding it. It's possible, I said. I spent years building reports that went to the district attorney's office. Insurance fraud, embezzlement, elder exploitation cases. My name rarely appeared anywhere public. The attorneys who used my work were the ones whose names ended up in the papers, not mine. And one of those cases, Holloway said, involved an insurance fraud ring you investigated over 2 decades ago, correct? Correct. Can you tell the jury who handled the prosecution intake on that case? I felt something settle over the room before I even said it. A stillness that had nothing to do with the jury and everything to do with the man sitting above us all in his black robe, half turned toward his own notes, still unaware of what was about to reach him. A young assistant district attorney, I said, handling intake at the time. Travell Braddock. The room didn't gasp. It went quieter than that, the particular silence of 100 people realizing something at once and not yet knowing what to do with it. I watched him. I made myself watch him, because I had waited weeks to see this moment happen and I wasn't going to let myself miss it. Judge Braddock's pen stopped moving mid-line. His eyes lifted slowly from the papers in front of him, first toward Holloway, then toward me, and I watched 2 decades of distance collapse in the space of a single breath. His hand, resting on the bench, began to tremble, just slightly, just enough that the court reporter beside him glanced up, uncertain. "Winfield," he said, so quiet at first I almost thought I'd imagined it. Then, louder, disbelieving, a whisper that carried anyway because the whole room had gone still enough to hear it. "My God, is that really her?" Nobody moved. Every face in that gallery turned. Odell Marsh in the back row, the reporter with her notepad frozen mid-sentence, Jared half risen from his seat without seeming to notice he'd moved at all. Braddock cleared his throat once, twice, visibly gathering himself back into the role the whole room still needed him to hold. "Let the record reflect," he said, voice steadier now, but not entirely steady, "that this court has just learned the witness's prior professional work intersected with cases this judge handled early in his career as a prosecutor, though the two of us were never previously acquainted in person. In the interest of full disclosure, I want counsel for both sides to be heard on whether that history warrants my recusal from these proceedings." Aldridge rose first, visibly caught off guard, and after a brief, murmured exchange with Chantel, stated he saw no basis to request recusal given the evidence had already been fully presented. Holloway concurred, noting the connection was historical, indirect, and had no bearing on the documentary evidence already before the court. Braddock nodded slowly, accepting both positions onto the record. "Then I'll remain on the bench," he said, "and rule on the evidence as presented, nothing more." I held his eyes across that courtroom, and for the first time since I buried my husband, since a stranger handed me papers in my own driveway, since my son called me by my first name like I was a woman he'd never met. For the first time, someone in that room actually knew who I was. Not the mother who disappeared into quiet rooms without explanation. The investigator whose work, unseen and uncredited, had shaped the very career of the man now sitting in judgment of her. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he said, already rising from the bench. "Before I rule." 15 minutes felt longer than the 3 weeks that came before it. Holloway sat beside me at the defense table, quiet, unreadable in the way she'd been through the whole trial, though I noticed her hands were folded a little tighter than before. I kept my own hands still in my lap and waited, the way I'd waited through 100 verdicts that weren't mine, back when waiting was just part of the job instead of the whole of my life. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Braddock walked back in composed, the tremor gone from his hands. though something in his face hadn't fully settled back into place yet. "For the record," he began, "this court has already addressed, prior to recess, the historical connection disclosed between this bench and the witness, and both parties confirmed no objection to my continued presence. That ruling stands." He let that settle a moment before continuing. "We'll proceed on the evidence alone." Before he addressed the jury further, Holloway rose. "Your Honor, at this time, the defense moves for judgment as a matter of law. The evidence presented establishes, without dispute, that ownership predates the marriage by years, and that the joint signature card in question conveyed no transfer of control. No reasonable jury could find otherwise on this record." Braddock nodded slowly, glancing once more at the documents in front of him before he spoke. "Given the evidence before this court, I find that no reasonable jury could conclude the defendant exercised undue influence over her husband's assets, when the record clearly shows those assets predate the marriage itself by years, in some cases, decades." He looked up, first toward the jury, then, briefly, toward me. "The court grants the motion. Judgment as a matter of law in favor of the defendant. This case is dismissed." The court further notes, for the record, that the claims as presented lacked evidentiary support from the outset. I didn't move right away. I let the words settle the way you let hot water settle before you trust it not to burn you. Beside me, Aldridge sat very still, jaw tight, already gathering his papers with the stiff efficiency of a man who understood there was nothing left to argue. Across the aisle, Jared sat frozen, staring at the space where the judge had just been, like the ruling hadn't finished traveling from his ears to whatever part of him still needed to understand it. I gathered my own folder slowly, nodded once to Holloway, and rose from my seat without a word to anyone at the plaintiff's table. I walked out into the hallway alone, Holloway, a step behind me, speaking quietly about next steps I only half heard. And it was there, near the tall windows at the end of the corridor, that I heard Chantel's voice rise sharp behind me. "This is not the life I signed up for. A dismissed case and legal fees we don't have. I told you this was a mistake the moment it started costing us instead of paying out." I turned my head just enough to see her standing a few feet from Jared, coat already over one arm, eyes hard, and finished in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with disappointment. She didn't wait for him to answer. She walked straight past him, heels sharp against the marble floor, out through the courthouse doors, without a single glance back. Jared stood there alone in the middle of that hallway, shoulders low, looking suddenly much smaller than the man who'd sat stone-faced through 3 weeks of hearings. Holloway touched my arm gently. "I'll bring the car around," she said, stepping off toward the exit. I turned to walk the other way, toward the quiet end of the hall. I hadn't gone more than a few steps before I heard footsteps behind me, hesitant, uneven, unmistakably his. I stopped walking, but didn't turn around right away, giving him the same courtesy he'd never once given me. The chance to decide, on his own, whether he actually wanted to say something or just needed me to hear his footsteps. Mom. Not Priscilla. The first time he'd called me that since this whole thing started. I turned around slow. He stood a few feet away, hands loose at his sides, none of the stiff certainty left in him that had carried him through 3 weeks of sitting stone-faced across that aisle. "I don't even know where to start," he said. "You could start with the truth," I said, "since we're finally somewhere that allows it." He flinched, just slightly, but he didn't look away. "I heard you in there. Fraud investigator. 20 years. Cases the DA's office used." He shook his head slow, like the words still didn't fit right in his mouth. How did I not know that? Because I never told you, I said, and you never asked. Would you have told me? If I had asked? I thought about that honestly because he deserved honesty more than he deserved comfort right now. I don't know. Maybe. I spent your whole childhood deciding what mattered more, being present for you or being known by you. I chose present. I don't regret that choice. I regret that you grew up believing quiet meant empty. He was quiet a long moment, looking down at the marble floor between us, like it might offer him something easier to say than what was actually sitting in his chest. Chantel said you were hiding something, he finally said. I believed her because it was easier than admitting I'd never once wondered what my own mother did with her days before I was born. I know, I said. I watched you believe her. I understood it, even then. That doesn't make it right. No, I said, it doesn't. He looked up at me, eyes wet in a way he was clearly fighting against. 30-some years old and still, in that moment, looking like the boy who used to ask me what Daddy did for a living and never once turned the question toward me. I'm sorry, he said. I don't know if that means anything right now. It means something, I said. It doesn't undo 3 weeks of sitting across from me like I was a stranger you needed to be protected from. That's going to take longer than an apology in a hallway. He nodded, accepting that, no argument left in him. Can I call you? He asked. Not about the case, about any of it. All of it. You can call, I said. I can't promise you what you'll get when you do. I'm still the same woman I was before any of this. I just don't intend to hide her anymore. He nodded again, something settling in his face that looked, for the first time in weeks, like his own feelings instead of someone else's script. I didn't hug him. Some distances don't close in a single hallway, no matter how badly both people might want them to. I simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the doors where Holloway was waiting with the car, leaving him standing there with whatever he needed to sit with on his own. He asked me who I really was. I told him the truth, the only thing I'd never once had to steal.